A racist neighbor decides to kick a black family out of the neighborhood at any cost and goes to extreme measures, destroying their house, but he does not even suspect who is the head of this family and what price he will have to pay for it. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you watch this. From the rhythmic hum of the moving truck's engine filled the quiet suburban street as the Garrett family finally arrived at their new home. It was late morning and the sunlight spilled across the neat rows of houses, illuminating freshly mowed lawns, pristine driveways, and clusters of colorful flower beds. Everything about the neighborhood exuded an air of perfection, almost too perfect. Like a staged photograph inside the truck, chaos reigned, boxes rattled precariously as the vehicle came to a halt. Eliza Garrett sighed heavily, turning to glance over her shoulder at the back of the truck where their 4 children were nestled among suitcases and loose bags. The twins Marcus and Maya giggled as they poked at each other, oblivious to the gravity of the day. Kelly, their 12-year-old, sat with her headphones clamped firmly over her ears, staring sullenly out of the window. Jason, the eldest at 17, was scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable, while Eliza said, forcing brightness into her voice, "Here we are, home sweet home." The driver hopped out to open the back, and Leland Garrett, Captain Garrett, to his colleagues, was the first to step onto the driveway. His tall, commanding presence was a mixture of authority and calm resilience. He scanned the street, his sharp brown eyes taken in the scene with the professional's attachment. Everything about the neighborhood screamed normally, but something unsettled him. "This is it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. He turned to Eliza and nodded. "Looks like it'll be a good place for us." Eliza stepped down, shielding her eyes from the sun as she assessed the 2-story house. It was larger than their last home and came with a sprawling backyard, perfect for the kids. Yet she couldn't shake a creeping sense of unease. Perhaps it was just the stress of moving, or the way the man across the street had been staring at them since they arrived. He stood on his porch, arms crossed, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the new arrivals. His posture was rigid, as though even this act of observing them was an intrusion on his tightly controlled world. Leland noticed him immediately and offered a polite nod. The man didn't nod back. "Who's that?" Eliza whispered. "Neighbor, I guess," Leland replied, his voice low. "Doesn't seem too friendly." Eliza frowned but said nothing. Instead, she turned to the kids. "All right, everyone, time to get to work. Unpack what you can and don't forget to keep your boxes labeled." Jason hopped down from the truck with a groan, brushing off his jeans. "This place is way too quiet. Are we sure we didn't move into a retirement community? Be helpful, Jason," Eliza snapped, though there was no real anger in her tone as the movers began unloading. Leland carried the first box to the porch. The man across the street hadn't moved. Leland felt the weight of his stare and wondered what it was about their presence that bothered him so much. He shook it off. There was no point in jumping to conclusions. By late afternoon, the house was alive with the chaos of settling, and boxes were scattered across the living room. The kitchen smelled faintly of the pizza they had ordered for lunch, and the twins were already arguing over who got which room. Jason had retreated to his own space, headphones on, as he unpacked at a snail's pace. It wasn't until the sun began to dip behind the houses that Leland allowed himself a moment to relax. He stood in the backyard admiring the wide open space, imagining summer barbecues and late-night stargazing with his family for the first time in months. He felt a flicker of hope. You think it'll be all right? Eliza's voice broke through his thoughts. She had joined him, a glass of lemonade in hand. Leland hesitated before answering. It'll take some getting used to, he admitted, but yeah, I think we'll make it work. Eliza followed his gaze to the yard and nodded. The kids seem happy enough, well, except Kelly, but she's 12, she's supposed to be miserable. They laughed softly, but the moment was cut short by a loud crash from the front yard. Leland's police instincts kicked in instantly. He moved swiftly around the house with Eliza close behind. There on the sidewalk lay their new mailbox, its post splintered and bent. Standing over it was the man from across the street. What happened here? Leland asked, his voice steady but firm. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. Looks like it fell, he said flatly, though the smirk tugging at his lips betrayed him. Fell, Leland repeated. From what? A tornado? The man shrugged. Cheap W. I guess you might want to get that replaced. You know, something sturdier. Leland's fist clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. Thanks for the advice, he said evilly. The man turned without another word and walked back to his house. Eliza placed a hand on Leland's arm. Don't, she whispered. Not today. Jason appeared at the doorway, his phone in hand. You see that guy? Total psycho. He's been watching us all day. Get inside, Leland ordered. Now Jason lingered a moment before retreating. Leland crouched to inspect the broken post. There were fresh marks on the wood as though it had been deliberately struck. He looked up at the neighbor's house where the man now stood at his window, staring back. That night, as the family settled into their new home, the incident lingered in the back of everyone's mind. Leland tried to push it aside, telling himself it was a minor inconvenience, not a sign of something bigger. But as he lay awake in bed listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't welcome here. It was only the first day, but something told him this was just the beginning. The first night in the new house passed in uneasy silence. Despite the exhaustion from moving, sleep came reluctantly to the Garrett family. Leland lay awake longer than he'd intended, staring at the ceiling as the faint sounds of the neighborhood filtered through the open window. Crickets chirped, distant cars hummed along the main road, and occasionally a muffled bark echoed from another yard. It should have been peaceful, yet something about the quiet unsettled him. When morning came, he was already awake, standing in the kitchen with a steaming mug of coffee in hand. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint tang of cardboard and paint boxes lined every corner, a chaotic reminder of the day before. Eliza appeared in the doorway, her hair tied back in a loose bun, holding her own mug of tea. Did you sleep? She asked, leaning against the counter a little. Leland lied. She gave him a knowing look but didn't press further. The kids are still out. I thought they'd be up at dawn ready to explore. They'll come around, Leland said. He took a long sip of coffee, then set the mug down. I'll check the yard before breakfast. Eliza nodded, and as he stepped outside, the cool morning air greeted him. The broken mailbox still lay where it had fallen, or rather been pushed onto the sidewalk. He knelt to inspect it again, running his fingers over the wood's jagged edges. His gaze wandered to the house across the street. The curtains in the front window were drawn tightly shut. Looks like it wasn't just Badwood, came a voice behind him. Leland turned to see Jason standing on the porch, his arms crossed. His son's tone was casual, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed his unease. Go back inside, Jay, Leland said. We'll deal with this later. Jason shrugged. Just saying, you know, it wasn't an accident. Leland didn't respond. Instead, he picked up the mailbox and carried it to the garage, ignoring the heaviness in his chest. By mid-morning, the house was alive with activity again. The twins ran through the hallways giggling as they played some made-up game that involved bouncing a tennis ball off the walls. Kelly sat at the dining table unpacking her art supplies with an expression of forced indifference, while Jason alternated between scrolling on his phone and helping Eliza arrange furniture in the living room. Everything seemed to be settling into a routine until Leland heard the sharp clang of metal against concrete. Outside, he moved quickly to the window and saw a garbage can overturned near the driveway, its contents spilled across the pavement. A pair of crows pecked curiously at the mess, but the scene felt too deliberate. The garbage had been neatly bagged the night before, the lid secured tightly. Eliza, he called, and she appeared beside him. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight. Do you think it was she? Trailed off, her voice dropping. Leland nodded grimly. He didn't have proof, but he knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Not after the mailbox. I'll clean it up, he said, stepping outside. He felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. The houses were still, curtains drawn in nearly every window. He glanced at the neighbor's house, expecting to see the man from yesterday, but the porch was empty. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered, tightening his chest. By the time the trash was picked up, Leland's frustration had turned to resolve. He went inside, washed his hands, and called for Jason. Come with me, he said. Jason raised an eyebrow but followed without question. They walked across the street, stopping at the edge of the neighbor's driveway. Leland knocked firmly on the door, his knuckles echoing against the wood. It took longer than necessary for the man to answer, and when he did, his expression was as cold and unmoving as it had been the day before. Something I can help you with? The man asked, his tone dripping with disinterest. Leland straightened his shoulders. Just wanted to introduce myself properly. Leland. Garrett, my son Jason. Jason gave a curt nod, saying nothing. The man's gaze flickered between them, his lips curling into a tight, insincere smile. Walter Hanley, I suppose you've moved into number 14. That's right, Leland said. He kept his tone polite but firm. We had a couple of incidents last night. Trash cans knocked over, mailbox broken. Wondering if you'd seen anything. Walter smiled, didn't waver. Can't say I have. Things like that happen. The wind, maybe. Jason scoffed softly, earning a sharp glance from his father. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly as though savoring the tension. Well, if you do see anything, Leland continued, ignoring the jab, I'd appreciate it if you let us know. Of course, Walter said. The words were polite, but his tone carried a subtle edge of mockery. He didn't invite them in or offer a handshake. Instead, he stepped back and closed the door without another word. Jason exhaled sharply as they walked back across the street. What was the point of that? He's obviously lying. Leland didn't answer immediately. When they reached the driveway, he turned to his son. The point is to let him know we're watching too. Now go help your mother. Jason muttered something under his breath but obeyed. Leland lingered for a moment, glancing back at Walter's house. The curtains in the front window moved slightly as though someone had just stepped away. Leland clenched his jaw and went inside. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, the family tried to unwind after another long day of unpacking. The twins were glued to the television. Kelly had retreated to her room and Eliza was in the kitchen experimenting with the unfamiliar layout as she prepared dinner. Leland sat in the living room flipping absently through a local newspaper. Hey Dad, Jason said, entering the room. He held up his phone showing a picture of their mailbox taken from across the street. Where did you get this? Leland asked, sitting up straighter. I took it last night, thought it might be a good idea, in case something else happens. Leland studied the photo. It didn't show much, just the broken mailbox against the dark backdrop of the yard, but the angle suggested it had been taken quickly without much time to frame the shot. His chest tightened at the implication that Jason had felt the need to document what should have been a simple act of vandalism. You shouldn't be sneaking around like that, Leland said, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. Leave this to me. Jason nodded, reluctantly slipping the phone back into his pocket. I just thought it might help. Leland placed a hand on his son's shoulder. It might just be careful. The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Leland sprang to his feet, his heart pounding. Eliza ran into the living room, her face pale. What was that? She asked. They found the source. Quickly, a rock about the size of a fist lay on the kitchen floor amidst shards of broken glass. A note was tied to it with rough twine. Leland picked it up carefully, his jaw tightening as he read the message, scrawled in uneven handwriting. Go back where you came from. The family gathered around him, their faces a mixture of fear and anger. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Leland folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. We're not going anywhere, he said firmly. The morning after the rock crashed through the window, the Garrett household was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Even the twins, who usually filled the air with their boundless energy, sat subdued at the breakfast table, stirring their cereal with little interest. The broken kitchen window had been hastily covered with cardboard, a reminder of the previous night's hostility. Leland sat at the head of the table, his expression a mask of calm he wore for his family's sake. Inside he churned with anger and frustration. He had spent years cultivating his ability to stay composed in the face of adversity. It was a skill that had served him well in the police force, but this felt different. This wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on his home, his family, and everything he'd worked so hard to protect. Eliza placed a hand on his shoulder as she passed him on the way to the sink. We need to talk about what to do next, she said softly, her voice just low enough to keep the children from overhearing. We will, Leland replied, though he wasn't sure yet what the next step would be. Reporting the incident to the police felt futile. The last visit from his colleagues had been perfunctory at best. He wasn't naive, he knew how these situations played out, especially in communities like this. Jason entered the room. His phone in hand, he slid into a chair, scrolling through the screen with a scowl on his face. You're not going to believe this, he muttered, breaking the silence. What now, Leland asked. Jason turned the phone toward his father, showing a blurry photo posted in a local neighborhood forum. The image was of their house taken from the street. Beneath it was a caption, new folks on Maple Lane don't seem to fit in, do they? Leland's jaw tightened. He took the phone and scrolled through the comments, each one more insidious than the last. Thinly veiled suggestions about the family's background, outright accusations of being troublemakers, and even a few posts speculating about Leland's job. Who posted this? Eliza asked, peering over his shoulder. Jason shrugged. It's anonymous, but I've got a good guess. Leland handed the phone back, his mind already racing. He wasn't just fighting one man, this was a coordinated effort. Walter Hanley was the ringleader, no doubt, but it was clear he wasn't acting alone. Leland felt the weight of the task ahead and wondered if he was ready for it. By mid-morning he decided to act. After breakfast he retrieved his tools from the garage and began repairing the broken mailbox. The act was as much symbolic as it was practical. Walter had to see that they weren't going to back down, that the Garretts were here to stay. As he worked he felt eyes on him. He didn't need to look up to know Walter was watching across the street. The blinds in the front window shifted slightly, the faintest movement but enough to confirm his suspicion. Leland's hand tightened around the hammer, but he forced himself to stay focused. Dad, Jason's voice broke the tension. Leland turned to see his son standing at the edge of the driveway holding a notebook. What's that, he asked. Jason hesitated before answering. I've been keeping track of everything, the graffiti, the trash, the rock, all of it. If this keeps up we'll need evidence. Leland felt a surge of pride at his son's initiative, but it was tinged with sadness. Jason shouldn't have to do this. He should be focused on school, friends, and typical teenage concerns, not documenting acts of hate against his family. That's good, Jay, Leland said. Just be careful, don't put yourself in harm's way. Jason nodded, his expression serious. I know. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension in the house was palpable. Eliza busied herself with unpacking, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for the younger kids while Jason continued adding to his growing log of incidents. Kelly stayed in her room, emerging only for meals, her usual chatter replaced by sullen silence. That evening, just as the family was sitting down to dinner, there was a knock at the door. Leland tensed immediately. He stood signaling for Eliza to stay with the kids and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw a young girl no older than 10 standing on the porch. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her hands and glanced nervously over her shoulder. Leland opened the door slowly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone gentle. The girl looked up at him with wide eyes. "I'm Emma," she said. "I live down the street." Leland nodded, recognizing her as the daughter of one of the more distant neighbors. "Hi, Emma, is everything okay?" She hesitated, then thrust the paper toward him. "I thought you should have this," she said quickly. "I can't stay. My parents don't know I'm here." Before Leland could respond, she turned and ran down the steps, disappearing into the twilight. He watched her go, then unfolded the paper. The message inside was written in a child's scrawl: "Be careful, Mr. Hanley is dangerous." Leland's grip on the paper tightened. He closed the door and returned to the dining room, his mind racing. He didn't share the note with the family, at least not yet. There was no need to add to their fear. The following morning, Leland decided it was time to confront the situation head on. He spent hours on the phone calling the local precinct and arranging a meeting with his superior. It wasn't easy. The responses he received ranged from polite indifference to outright dismissal. Still, he persisted, eventually convincing one of his colleagues to visit the house that afternoon. When the officer arrived, Leland felt a flicker of hope, but it quickly faded as the man, Sergeant Carter, stood in the driveway jotting down notes with the air of someone fulfilling a tedious obligation. "We'll look into it," Carter said, his tone clipped, "but unless you have concrete evidence or witnesses, there's not much we can do." Leland clenched his jaw. "And what about the rock, the graffiti?" Carter shrugged. "Could be kids messing around. Happens all the time in neighborhoods like this." "Neighborhoods like this?" Leland repeated, his voice rising. "What's that supposed to mean?" Carter held up his hands defensively. "I'm just saying there's no proof this is anything more than mischief." Leland's frustration boiled over. "This isn't mischief. It's targeted harassment. If you don't take it seriously, it's only going to escalate." Carter sighed, closing his notebook. "I'll file the report. That's all I can promise." As the officer drove away, Leland felt the familiar sting of disappointment. He'd known it would be an uphill battle, but the lack of support from his own colleagues was a bitter pill to swallow. That night, as the family gathered in the living room, Leland shared the note from Emma. The twins clung to Eliza, their wide eyes filled with fear, while Jason's expression darkened with anger. "We'll get through this," Leland said firmly, "but we need to be smart. No one goes outside alone, and if you see anything suspicious, you tell me immediately." Jason nodded, his jaw set. "What about Hanley? Are you going to confront him?" "Not yet," Leland replied. "I need more than suspicion before I do anything." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tension. They all knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. The wind picked up overnight, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and a foreboding chill that seemed to settle over the Garrett household. Leland stood by the window of the living room, staring out at the dimly lit street. His reflection in the glass mirrored his unease. The events of the past days weighed heavily on him: the rock through the window, the note from Emma, and the blatant indifference of the police. He was a man who thrived on order, on logic, but nothing about this situation felt within his control. Behind him, Eliza entered the room, wrapping her cardigan tightly around her shoulders. "You should get some sleep," she said gently, but her tone carried its own exhaustion. "I will," Leland replied, though they both knew it was a lie. "I just want to keep an eye on things for a little while." Eliza placed a hand on his arm. "Leland, we can't live like this, on edge every moment of the day. It's not good for the kids or for us." "I know," he said, his voice heavy, "but I need to protect this family. I can't let him win." She sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she kissed his cheek and retreated to their bedroom, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of the darkness outside. The following morning began like any other, with the twins clamoring for pancakes and Kelly dragging herself to the table with her usual reluctance. Jason, however, was unusually quiet. He sat scrolling through his phone, his brow furrowed as he read something on the screen. "What's going on, Jay?" Leland asked as he poured himself a second cup of coffee. Jason hesitated before turning the phone toward his father. "I think you should see this." Leland took the phone and scanned the screen. It was another post in the local neighborhood forum, this time with a picture of their house and a caption that read, "Still here? Why?" The comments below were filled with thinly veiled threats and mockery, each one more venomous than the last. "Who's posting this?" Eliza asked, her voice shaking as she looked over Leland's shoulder. "It has to be Hanley," Jason said. "Who else would go this far?" Leland set the phone down with a heavy sigh. "It doesn't matter who's posting it. What matters is that it stops." The tension in the house was palpable as the family tried to go about their day. But the Garretts didn't have to wait long for the next escalation. It began mid-afternoon. Leland was working in the backyard when the rumble of heavy machinery interrupted the quiet. He straightened, wiping his brow, and turned toward the street. His chest tightened as he saw a massive yellow excavator rolling onto their property. At its controls sat a wiry man in a dirty cap, while Walter Hanley strode confidently beside it, his smirk broad and unapologetic. The excavator rumbled closer, its claw poised as though ready to strike. "What the hell is this?" Leland shouted, dropping his tools and storming toward the commotion. Hanley raised a hand, signaling the operator to stop. "Just fixing a mistake," he said, loud enough for the neighbors now gathering on their lawns to hear. "Your house is built on my land." Leland's pulse quickened. "You know that's a lie. Get that thing off my property before I call the police." "Go ahead," Hanley sneered. "See if they care. You don't belong here, Garrett, and I'm just making it easier for you to leave." Before Leland could respond, Hanley motioned to the operator, who resumed his work. The excavator moved forward, its claw crashing into the front porch with a deafening splinter of wood. The twins screamed from inside the house, and Eliza ran to gather them, her face pale with fear. "Stop!" Leland shouted, moving toward the machine, but Hanley blocked his path. "You think you can intimidate me, Officer Garrett?" Hanley mocked, his voice dripping with venom. "This is my land, and I'm just taking back what's mine." Jason emerged from the house, his phone raised and recording. "I'm filming this," he shouted. "You're going to jail for this, Hanley." Hanley's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Film all you want, kid. No one's going to believe you." The excavator swung its claw again, this time smashing through one of the house's support beams. Leland's instincts as a protector kicked in. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "We need police at 14 Maple Lane immediately," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "This is an active property destruction case." As the excavator moved to strike again, Jason shouted, "Stop! You're going to bring the whole house down." The operator hesitated, looking to Hanley for instruction. Hanley's bravado wavered, his smirk replaced by a flash of uncertainty. "Keep going," he barked, though his voice lacked conviction. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The excavator operator, now visibly nervous, shut off the machine and climbed down, muttering something about not wanting to get arrested. "You coward," Hanley snapped, furious. "Finish the job." But it was too late. Two police cars screeched to a halt in front of the Garrett's house, and officers poured out, their hands resting on their holsters. "Step away from the property," one of them ordered, his voice authoritative. Hanley raised his hands, his smirk returning as he feigned innocence. "Just a property dispute, officer," he said smoothly. "No need for overreaction." The officer glanced at the damage, the smashed porch, the cracked walls, the frightened family huddled inside. He turned back to Hanley, his expression cold. "This is criminal damaged property. You're under arrest." As the officers cuffed Hanley and led him to the squad car, Leland approached the lead officer, his shoulders squared. "Thank you for responding," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We saw the video your son uploaded," the officer said, nodding toward Jason, who stood nearby with his phone still in hand. "It's clear-cut evidence. This isn't going to go away for him." Leland placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, pride and relief flooding through him. "Good job, son," he said quietly. That night, the Garrett family sat together in the living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. The damage to the house was significant, but they were safe, and Hanley was finally facing consequences for his actions. Eliza looked at Leland, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "You protected us." Leland nodded, his gaze moving to his children. "We protected each other," he said. "And we'll keep doing it, no matter what." As the family huddled closer, the flickering light of the television cast warm shadows across their faces. They felt something they hadn't in weeks: hope. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of weather that made everything feel sharper and more oppressive. The Garrett family sat around the breakfast table in silence, the air thick with tension. Even the twins, usually brimming with energy, pushed their cereal around their bowls without a word. Kelly, ever the quiet observer, stared at the rain-speckled window, her thoughts a mystery. Leland watched his family, his heart aching with the weight of his failure to shield them from the hostility that had surrounded them since the day they moved in. Eliza, seated beside him, reached for his hand under the table. Her touch was warm and reassuring, but he could feel her anxiety just beneath the surface. "We need to have a family meeting," Leland said finally, his voice breaking the silence. The twins looked up, their eyes wide, while Jason leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "About what?" Jason asked, though he already knew. Leland took a deep breath. "About what happened yesterday. About what's been happening since we got here." Eliza nodded, her gaze moving between the children. "Your dad and I think it's time we come up with a plan. Things aren't going to get better on their own, and we can't keep living like this." Jason straightened, his expression hardening. "So what's the plan? Do we leave? Give Hanley what he wants?" "No," Leland said firmly. "We're not leaving. This is our home, and we're going to fight for it. But we need to be smart about how we do it." Kelly's voice, soft and hesitant, cut through the conversation. "What if it gets worse? What if he hurts us?" The room fell silent. Leland's chest tightened at the sight of the fear in his daughter's eyes. He leaned forward, his voice steady and reassuring. "I won't let that happen. None of us will. We're a team, and we're going to protect each other." Jason scoffed, shaking his head. "A team? We're sitting ducks, Dad. Hanley's got half the neighborhood on his side, and the cops don't care. How are we supposed to fight back?" Leland met his son's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "We start by documenting everything, every incident, every threat, every piece of evidence. We build a case." Jason nodded slowly, his earlier frustration giving way to determination. "I've already got a lot of footage. I'll keep recording." "Good," Leland said. "And we'll talk to a lawyer, see what legal options we have." Eliza placed a hand on Leland's arm. "We also need to focus on the kids, make sure they feel safe." "I'll handle that," Leland promised. "We'll all handle it together." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose, though the tension lingered like a shadow over the household. As the day wore on, the family busied themselves with their tasks. Jason spent hours organizing his footage, while Eliza called local attorneys to schedule consultations. Leland, unable to sit still, worked on repairing the damage to the yard, his hands moving with the precision of a man trying to regain control of something, anything. But the calm didn't last. It was late afternoon when the shouting began. Leland was in the backyard when he heard the voices, angry and rising in volume. He dropped his tools and hurried to the front of the house, his heart pounding. A group of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces twisted with hostility. At the center of the group stood Hanley, his smirk replaced with a sneer. He held a megaphone, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This neighborhood isn't for everyone," Hanley shouted, his words dripping with venom. "We've got standards to uphold. If you don't like it, you can leave." Jason appeared beside Leland, his phone in hand. "I'm recording," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Eliza stepped out of the house, her expression a mix of fear and anger. The twins clung to her legs, their small faces pale with confusion and fright. Kelly stood just behind her, her hands trembling as she held her phone. Leland stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "That's enough," he called out. "This is harassment, and it needs to stop." Hanley turned the megaphone toward Leland, his sneer widening. "Harassment? You don't belong here, Garrett. We're just defending our community." "This is my community too," Leland said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement with Hanley, while others shifted uncomfortably. Leland caught the eye of one woman who quickly looked away, her guilt evident. Not everyone in the neighborhood shared Hanley's hatred, but fear kept them silent. "You think you can scare me and my family?" Leland continued, his voice strong and unwavering. "You think your threats will make us leave? You're wrong. We're not afraid of you." Hanley laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "We'll see about that." With a wave of his hand, Hanley signaled the crowd to disperse. They left reluctantly, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. Hanley lingered for a moment, his eyes locking with Leland's in a silent challenge, before turning and walking away. As the last of the neighbors disappeared, Leland turned to his family. Jason was still recording, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Eliza looked shaken but resolute, her arms wrapped protectively around the twins. Kelly stood stiffly, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" Leland asked, his gaze moving between them. Eliza nodded, though her grip on the twins tightened. "We're fine, but this has to stop, Leland. It's getting out of control." "I know," he said, "and it will. I promise." That evening, Leland sat with Eliza at the kitchen table, the note from Emma spread out between them. Jason joined them, his laptop open as he played back the footage he'd taken earlier. "This is good," Leland said, watching the video. "It shows how organized they are. This isn't just one man, it's a coordinated effort." "But will it be enough?" Eliza asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "The police didn't care before. Why would they care now?" "We'll make them care," Leland said. "And if they don't, we'll go hire the media, civil rights groups, whatever it takes." Jason leaned forward, his expression serious. "What about Hanley? He's not going to stop." Leland's jaw tightened. "We'll deal with him too legally." The rest of the evening was spent strategizing, the family coming together like never before. Despite the fear and uncertainty, there was a sense of unity, of purpose. They were no longer just reacting, they were preparing for the fight ahead. As the house fell silent that night, Leland lay awake, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew they couldn't afford to give up. This was their home, and they would defend it together. The days that followed the standoff with Walter Hanley and the mob were fraught with tension, but the Garrett family was resolute. The morning after the confrontation, Leland and Jason sat together in the kitchen, reviewing the footage Jason had captured. The video, clear and damning, was their strongest weapon yet. Jason leaned forward, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop. "This has to get out there, Dad. The police aren't going to help us, but if enough people see this..." He trailed off, his eyes meeting Leland's. "Maybe someone will." Leland nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen. The footage showed the crowd on their lawn, Hanley with his megaphone, and Leland standing firm in the face of their threats. It was raw and undeniable, a stark portrayal of the hatred they were up against. "Let me handle it," Leland said finally. "We'll take this to the right people, but I want to do it carefully." "No leaks yet." Jason hesitated but eventually nodded. "Okay. But don't wait too long. This can't keep going." "I know," Leland said, squeezing his son's shoulder. "We're going to fix this." That afternoon, Leland decided to take a more proactive approach. He spent hours combing through local property records and zoning documents, determined to find anything that could weaken Hanley's position. His persistence paid off when he stumbled across a discrepancy in the records. A parcel of land registered to Hanley overlapped with a section of his own property. The paperwork was sloppy, but it was enough to raise questions. He printed the documents and showed them to Eliza later that evening. This could be our leverage, he said, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. If Hanley's claims about the fence and the property line are based on this, he's in trouble. Eliza studied the papers, her brow furrowing. You think this will hold up in court? It doesn't have to, Leland replied. All we need is enough doubt to undermine him. If we can show that he's been manipulating the system. Eliza nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we use it. Whatever it takes. The next morning, Leland made an appointment with a lawyer recommended by one of his colleagues. He arrived at the small downtown office with a stack of documents and a sense of cautious hope. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Reyes, listened intently as Leland laid out the situation. This is a mess, Margaret said after reviewing the documents. But it's a mess that works in your favor. If Hanley's claims are based on these records, we can challenge them. It'll take time, but we can make a case. How much time? Leland asked. Margaret hesitated. Weeks, maybe months. But in the meantime, we can file a cease and desist order. It won't stop him completely, but it'll send a message. Leland nodded, his jaw tightening. Do it. As he left the office, Leland felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he had a concrete plan of action. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Leland shared the news. We've got a lawyer, he said, his tone firm, and we've got a plan. Hanley's going to have to answer for what he's done. The twins cheered, their spirits lifted for the first time in days. Jason nodded approvingly, while Kelly offered a small, hopeful smile. Even Eliza seemed lighter, her shoulders less burdened. But their relief was short-lived. Later that night, as the family settled in for bed, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Leland was out of bed in an instant, rushing to the living room. There, he found the front window smashed, shards of glass glittering on the floor. A brick lay in the center of the room, a piece of paper tied to it with twine. Eliza appeared behind him, her hand over her mouth. Not again, she whispered. Leland picked up the brick, his hands trembling with anger. He unfolded the paper and read the message scrawled in crude, jagged letters, "Get out while you still can." Jason joined them, his phone already in hand. I'll take pictures, he said, his voice steady but filled with fury. Leland nodded. Do it. We need everything documented. As Jason moved around the room, snapping photos, Leland called the police. This time, the dispatchers sounded more concerned, likely aware of the previous reports. Within 15 minutes, 2 officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they surveyed the scene. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair, approached Leland. This is escalating, he said grimly. Do you have any idea who might be behind this? Leland's jaw tightened. Hanley. He's been leading this charge from the start. The officer nodded. We'll file a report and increase patrols in the area, but without direct evidence. I know, Leland interrupted, his frustration bubbling to the surface. But I'm telling you, it's him. We'll do what we can, the officer said, though his tone lacked conviction. As the officers left, Leland turned to his family. This isn't going to scare us. We're stronger than this. Eliza nodded, pulling the twins close. Jason stood beside his father, his expression hard. We'll make them pay for this, Jason said quietly. We will, Leland promised, but we'll do it the right way. The next day, Leland received a call from Margaret. The cease and desist order is ready, she said. We'll serve it to Hanley this afternoon. Leland agreed to meet her at Hanley's property, his chest tightening at the thought of facing his neighbor again. When they arrived, Hanley was waiting on his porch, his smirk firm in place. This is cute, Hanley said as Margaret handed him the papers. You really think this is going to stop me? It's a legal order, Margaret replied coolly. Ignore it at your own risk. Hanley laughed, the sound grating. You're in over your head, Garrett. You and your lawyer. Leland stepped forward, his voice low and steady. This isn't a game, Hanley. You've gone too far, and now you're going to answer for it. Hanley's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that." As Leland and Margaret walked away, he felt a sense of satisfaction. For the first time, Hanley looked unsure. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, Leland sat with Jason, reviewing the footage and evidence they had gathered, the brick, the threats, the videos. It was all coming together. They had a case, and they were ready to fight. "We're going to win this," Jason said, his voice filled with determination. Leland placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We are, but it's going to take all of us." As the family prepared for the next battle, Leland felt a renewed sense of hope. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were fighting back. The morning after serving Walter Hanley with the cease and desist order felt like a tentative step toward reclaiming normalcy. The Garrett family gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, sunlight streaming through the windows, a welcome contrast to the dark clouds that had hung over them for weeks. Though the tension hadn't completely lifted, there was a renewed sense of purpose among them. Jason sat at the table with his laptop open, sorting through the growing archive of videos, photos, and documents he had meticulously compiled. The twins chatted quietly over their cereal, their usual energy subdued but beginning to resurface. Kelly, still reserved, watched her older brothers work with cautious curiosity. Eliza moved around the kitchen with a sense of calm determination, her movements efficient as she prepared breakfast. She glanced at Leland, who was sipping his coffee at the counter, his eyes scanning the morning paper. Despite the chaos they had endured, his posture radiated quiet strength. "What's next?" Eliza asked, setting a plate of eggs in front of him. Leland folded the paper and set it aside. "Margaret's filing the paperwork today. Hanley will have to respond to the order within a week. In the meantime, I'm meeting with the HOA to go over the zoning discrepancies. If we can prove he's been manipulating property lines, it'll weaken his case." "And the footage?" Jason asked, looking up from his laptop. Leland nodded. "We'll send it to the lawyer, but I also want to show it to a couple of civil rights organizations I've been in contact with. If we can get their support, it'll put more pressure on Hanley and the local authorities." Jason's eyes lit up with determination. "I'll organize everything. Make sure it's ready." "Good work, son," Leland said, his voice filled with pride. Later that day, Leland attended the HOA meeting, his shoulders squared as he entered the modest community center where it was being held. The room was filled with familiar faces, many of whom had been part of the mob on his lawn just days earlier. Some avoided his gaze, while others stared at him with thinly veiled hostility. The HOA president, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Connor, cleared her throat and called the meeting to order. "We're here to address recent events in the neighborhood and discuss property disputes that have come to light." Leland presented his findings, laying out the discrepancies in the property records with precision. He pointed to the overlapping parcels of land and highlighted the inconsistencies in Hanley's claims. "This isn't just about a fence," Leland said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about someone exploiting the system to intimidate and harass my family. And I believe the HOA has a responsibility to address it." The room murmured, some residents nodding in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Hanley, seated near the back, smirked but said nothing. Mrs. Connor looked over the documents Leland had provided, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Garrett, these are serious allegations. We'll need time to review them before taking any action." "Take all the time you need," Leland replied, "but know this, I'm not backing down." While Leland was at the meeting, Eliza stayed home with the children. The twins played in the backyard under her watchful eye, their laughter a welcome sound after weeks of fear and uncertainty. Kelly sat on the porch swing, sketching quietly in her notebook, while Jason continued organizing their evidence. Around mid-afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Eliza tensed, her mind immediately flashing to the worst-case scenario. She motioned for Jason to stay put and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, she saw a familiar face, Emma, the young girl who had warned them about Hanley weeks earlier. Eliza opened the door, her relief evident. "Emma, are you okay?" Emma nodded, clutching a small envelope in her hands. "I wanted to give this to you. My parents don't know I'm here. What is it? Eliza asked, her voice gentle. It's proof, Emma said hesitantly. Mr. Hanley told my dad to do something bad. I heard them talking. I wrote it down. Eliza's heart ached at the sight of the frightened girl, but she quickly ushered her inside. Thank you, Emma. You're very brave. Jason joined them in the living room, his interest piqued as Eliza opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note detailing a conversation Emma had overheard between Hanley and her father. According to the note, Hanley had pressured several neighbors into participating in the harassment campaign, threatening them with social and financial consequences if they refused. This is huge, Jason said, his excitement barely contained. We can use this. Eliza nodded, her mind racing. We need to show this to your dad. That evening, the family gathered in the living room to review Emma's note. Leland read it carefully, his expression darkening with each word. This changes everything, he said finally. If we can prove Hanley coerced the neighbors, it'll dismantle his entire narrative. But how do we prove it? Eliza asked. Leland looked at Jason. We keep gathering evidence, and we keep the pressure on. The next few days were a blur of activity. Leland met with civil rights organizations, sharing the footage and documents they had compiled. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, with several groups offering to help amplify their case. Meanwhile, Margaret filed additional motions, using Emma's note to strengthen their position. The tide began to turn. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent started to come forward, emboldened by the Garretts' determination. One by one, they shared their own stories of Hanley's manipulation and intimidation, painting a damning picture of the man who had once held the neighborhood in his grip. Hanley, sensing his control slipping, lashed out in desperation. One evening, as Leland and Jason were reviewing footage in the living room, a loud crash shattered the quiet. They rushed outside to find their car windows smashed, shards of glass littering the driveway. A crude message was spray-painted on the garage door, "Get out." Leland called the police, his voice steady but filled with cold anger. This time, the officers took the incident seriously, their demeanor shifting as they realized the scale of what was happening. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later. With mounting evidence against him, Hanley was served with multiple legal notices, including a formal investigation into his property records. The neighborhood, once divided, now stood united against him. The crowd that had once gathered to threaten the Garretts now demanded accountability from Hanley. Leland stood on his porch, watching as Hanley was escorted away by police. The man's smirk was gone, replaced by a scowl of defeat. It wasn't the end of the fight, there were still legal battles to be won, but it was a victory nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, the Garretts began to rebuild. The hateful messages were scrubbed away, the broken windows replaced, and the yard restored to its former beauty. The neighborhood, once a hostile place, began to feel like home. One afternoon, as the family worked together in the garden, Emma appeared at the edge of the yard. Leland waved her over, a genuine smile on his face. "Hi, Emma," he said. "What brings you by?" Emma hesitated, then held out a small sapling. "I thought you might want this for the yard." Leland took the sapling, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Emma. It's perfect." As the family planted the tree together, the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow over the yard. It was a small act, but it symbolized so much more: a new beginning, a testament to their resilience, and a reminder that even in the face of hatred, hope could take root and grow. With Hanley's legal issues mounting and the community rallying behind the Garretts, the family felt a weight lifting. Support poured in from unexpected places. Neighbors who had once ignored their plight began stopping by, offering apologies, assistance, and solidarity. The children slowly returned to their routines, their laughter ringing out in the backyard once more. Kelly resumed her art projects with newfound inspiration, often sketching scenes of unity and strength. Jason, now a skilled documentarian, helped compile the final case against Hanley, ensuring every piece of evidence was presented clearly and compellingly. One evening, as the family sat on the porch, Eliza turned to Leland. "We've come so far," she said, her voice filled with pride. We have, Leland replied, his gaze on the sapling Emma had brought. Its leaves swayed gently in the breeze, a symbol of growth and resilience. The neighborhood, transformed by the events, became a different place. The Garrett's perseverance had inspired others to speak out, to stand against injustice, and to foster a sense of community that hadn't existed before. For the Garrett family, the battle had been long and painful, but they had emerged stronger, closer, and more determined than ever to protect the life they had built together. And as the sapling grew, its roots digging deep into the soil, it stood as a reminder of their strength, a lasting legacy of hope in the face of adversity. Thank you for reading to the end of this transformative and powerful story. If you'd like to reflect or share your thoughts, feel free to do so. And remember, resilience and unity can overcome even the darkest challenges.